Welcome to your go-to podcast for the pool and spa industry. My name is Tyler Rasmussen.
And my name is Greg Villafania. And this is the Pool Chasers Podcast.
All right, Wayne. So we'd like to kind of jump into some water chemistry stuff here.
All right.
So let's break it down into different parts. So can you first maybe explain to us, what water chemistry is?
Right. Well, what is water chemistry? That's a loaded question in and of itself. But essentially, when you're dealing with pools and spas and obviously the water inside there, the chemistry of the water inside those vessels is important to test for and know the values for, because as we were talking about earlier, water can have a tendency to be corrosive or scale forming, or hopefully somewhere in between, balanced. And it's the chemistry of the water that helps determine that water balance. So there are a number of different tests you need to do, chemistry tests, in order to figure out what your water balance factors are, if there's proper sanitation and oxidation going on, things of that nature. And all of the tests are unique unto themselves, so require a little bit of talking about and talking about what's good about it, what's interferences, what you might experience with some of those individual issues.
So let's jump into the first topic here, which would be sanitation. Can you go through what chlorine is, what bromine is?
Absolutely. And right off the bat, I want to make a distinction that there is a difference in terminology here between sanitation and oxidation. It's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Sanitation is killing the nasty critters and organisms and bacteria that can possibly get into pool water. You want to kill something. Okay, I want to kill something. Okay, pow, pow. Exactly right. Hey, I'm from Baltimore. Oh God, you want to edit that one out? Anyhow,
for all you people from Baltimore,
I'm going to get calls. Anyhow, as opposed to oxidation, and oxidation is the burning off of organics in the water that can cause odors and irritations that you would experience, like itchy red eyes, blotchy skin, that kind of thing. So there's a difference. Two products do both at the same time, sanitize and oxide, and that's chlorine and bromine. None of the other products that are out on the market today do that. They might do one, they might do the other, but you have to add something to it as a supplemental whatever to provide that sanitation or oxidation process. But chlorine and bromine are the two biggies. So let's talk about chlorine. Okay, that's the biggie. That's the elephant in the room. Okay, that is the primary sanitizer mostly everybody uses in the country. Sanitizer and oxidizer, and it's a good thing. For most residential pools, 4 parts per million to 6 parts per million is pretty good. For commercial properties, it's about the same, but you might want a little bit higher if there's a heavy bather load, like if it was a Y or something like that, or a university natatorium that has a lot of swim teams, that kind of thing, and dive teams. Then you might want to bump it up just a little bit. But 4 to 6 is what you're looking for. When you're doing testing, when you're doing the actual chemistry to find out your chlorine values, as we've talked about before, the first test you're going to do is a free chlorine test. That's the good chlorine, the good cop. That's the form of chlorine that's actively sanitizing and oxidizing. That's what you want, okay? As it does its job, it breaks down into combined chlorine. That's the bad cop, the bad form of chlorine. We talked about that. But in and of itself, when you test for chlorine, some things can go wrong, okay? And one of them is too much of chlorine. And you experience something called bleaching or partial bleaching. And that's a situation where you're doing your chlorine test and you know for a fact, you swear on your life that there's chlorine in that water, but you add your reagents and nothing happens. It stays clear. Okay, so either one of two things is happening. Either there is indeed no chlorine in there and you're wrong, but you know you're not, or you've got too much chlorine in there and it's completely bleaching out the indicator. And that usually happens when the free chlorine level exceeds the upper limits of the comparator block. So, for example, on a Taylor comparator block, the upper limit for chlorine is 10 parts per million. When you get into the 10 to 15 part per million range of chlorine, if you've overdosed or for whatever reason, okay, there's so much chlorine in there that there's not enough indicator in the sample cell to read that high chlorine. So what do? Okay, after scratching your head for a couple of minutes, you look in the book and you read exactly how to do it. And it's even in the instructions on the inside of the lid of the kit. You do a 1-to-1 dilution, and that's pretty simple. 1 part pool water, 1 part water that has no chlorine in it, which is usually something like bottled water, which is the easiest. And you fill up the sample cell halfway with your pool or spa water sample, the rest of the way up with your bottled water. then do the test exactly like the instructions say. 5 drops of DBD1, 5 drops of DBD2. Boom, you get an answer. You match that color, but multiply your answer by 2. That's a 1-to-1 dilution. Now, in extreme circumstances, you can go higher. You can do a 1-to-5 dilution. And there's a little mark on the side of the comparator block, right? 1.8. Okay, you would fill that up with pool water to 1.8, the rest of the way up with non-chlorinated water, do the test, match a color, multiply your value by 5. But when you start doing extremes and dilutions, sometimes the colors are really tough to match. You really have to get the proper light and be really good at matching colors. But a 1-to-1 dilution is pretty simple. And that's what's going to mess up a chlorine test, is more chlorine. Okay. Same thing holds for bromine. If your bromine values are very, very high for whatever particular reason, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to partially bleach it out or totally bleach it out. And then you do the 1-to-1 dilution. Then when I say partially bleach it out, instead of it going completely colorless, in other words, nothing develops, you might get a value that's lower than you know that's in there based on what you added. Like there's at least 4 parts per million of chlorine in there, but you're matching a color that's 1.5 or 0.5 or something like that, and you're going, that's not right. Something's wrong. That's called a partial bleaching. Okay? And then you do the 1-to-1 dilution, and you'll be able to get your answer that way. And that's the easy way to take care of any kind of chlorine testing interferences.
And is it possible, would you ever get that bleaching or just the water just stays clear if, the reagent is bad or, something like that?
Right. No. And that's the good thing, if it can be called a good thing. The reagent that's going to go bad in that test is DPD number 2 because it's an oxidizer. It's in that brown bottle. Okay. And instead of coming out of the bottle clear, it comes out pink or red. And you're going to know right away that it's going to get a wrong answer. Okay, so without even worrying about whether it's getting into the sample or not, you're right away going to know it's bad. And don't use it, get a new bottle.
Right.
Can you explain exactly what chlorine is and why we've chosen to use that as the main sanitizer?
Sure. Chlorine, Cl is the atomic abbreviation, is a chemical that pretty much kills, sanitizes, and oxidizes. That's what we talked about. And it's in the classification on the periodic chart that includes things like bromine, iodine, arsenine, and a couple other things that nobody can pronounce. But for our purposes, it's chlorine. And chlorine came into use as a primary source of sanitation and oxidation actually in the 1950s. It was Clorox, the Clorox company, that actually promoted it. Of course, they make laundry bleach. We all know that. Mm-hmm. But when it came to using that kind of product, when somebody said, hey, this might be good in a pool or a spa situation, they found out that the strength of laundry grade Clorox was very weak. It's like 4 to 5% actual chlorine. Okay, they wanted to bump it up a little bit. So what they did was they created a product that we use today that we know as liquid chlorine, sodium hypochlorite. That's anywhere from 10 to 12% strength. And you create it by adding sodium hydroxide and water and throwing some electricity into it, and it forms sodium hypochlorite. The good thing about sodium hypochlorite, it is a liquid, instantaneous mix, not a problem. The disadvantage is it's heavy. Water weight, 8 pounds, 8.33 pounds per gallon. That's how much it weighs. And it degrades very quickly when you add it to water. So, and some good things, some great things. I always like sodium hypochlorite for shocking, because it's pretty much, it's there, it's right away. Okay. There's a few other forms of chlorine. You've got Cal Hypo, the granular product that's also great for shocking purposes. Lithium hypochlorite, which is apparently very difficult to get nowadays. It was a pricey product. It's a powder, very fine powder. And I understand that it's very difficult to get a hold of, so the prices have gone up really, really high. But that's great for shocking vinyl liner pools, above ground pools, things of that nature. So, and then you also have things like chlorine gas. And chlorine gas is really, really economical because it's 100% chlorine. It is chlorine. But it's also really, really dangerous to work with if you don't know what you're doing, because it can kill a lot of people, like it did in World War I, where it was called mustard gas.
Mustard gas.
Yeah. So not very many facilities in the country still use chlorine gas. It's still the most economical way to introduce it into the water. Baltimore used to have a public pool. It was actually a quarry that they turned into a public facility that was on chlorine gas for many, many years, but they pulled it because of the danger issue. But that's really the most economical form. And then those 4 forms of chlorine are called unstabilized chlorine. And what that means in English is that if you add 1 part per million worth of any one of those 4 forms of chlorine to water, okay, it's going to dissipate out in about 15 minutes in direct sunlight. And it will be faster if there's actually people in there, okay? And guess what? The people go in pools, you know? Yeah. So you want to add a product to help chlorine stay in the water longer to do the job it's supposed to do. And that's where the product cyanuric acid comes into play. Some people call it conditioner, some people call it stabilizer, some people call it a miracle, but that's what it is, okay? And you can add cyanuric acid separately, or it's part of the physical makeup of some chlorine products, specifically tablets. And there's 2 kinds of tablets, trichlor and dichlor. Trichlor is about 90% chlorine in its physical makeup. It's got a very, very low pH. Dichlor has about 56 to 65% chlorine, and has its pH is pretty much neutral. So it's really good if you have really high or really low kind of pH situations. It's not going to muck up the whole pH issue. But these are in erosion feeders and floaters, and they're introducing chlorine and cyanuric acid into the water. Now, the problem is with cyanuric acid, no good deed goes unpunished. Cyanuric acid works great in a range of 30 to 50 parts per million of cyanuric acid, regardless of where you're located. When I first started with Taylor in the early 90s, the belief in the industry was the closer you were to the equator, the more intense the rays of the sun were. So you would have to keep higher cyanuric acid readings. So like areas like Phoenix, Southern California, Florida, things like that, 100 parts per million or higher. Well, it turned out that that's really not true. The CDC did a study that they presented at the World Aquatic Health Conference in 2006 in Austin, Texas. I was there. I was at this presentation. And this 5-year study was on cyanuric acid and how it works. And they showed that readings above 50 parts per million flatlines as far as effectiveness. There's no additional benefit to having it. It's a waste of time, product, and money. And that at about 100 parts per million, it doesn't always happen, but it can happen, where you may experience something called chlorine lock. I don't know if you guys have heard about this before, but what it does is there's so much cyanuric acid in there that instead of working with chlorine, it actually prevents it from chlorine from getting out to doing what it's supposed to do. And the only way to lower cyanuric acid is really to partially drain the water and refill it back up with water that doesn't have it. So, that's chlorine, the traveling show of chlorine.
Right. And I think once we talk about each one of these, forms, especially, chlorine chemical, is storage. We have a warehouse facility, and obviously they're in the back of, the trucks and things like that. What is good practice for, storing maybe a pallet or 2 of liquid chlorine?
Again, the best case scenario is in some kind of air-conditioned warehouse facility. Now, I know I've been to distributors out here. I've been to distributors in Florida where basically their warehouses are just open buildings. No heat, no air conditioning, nothing. And you walk in there, it's like an oven. But remember, where you're located and in areas where the pool season is pretty much year-round, you're going to turn over very quick. So you're going to move that stuff out. Right. So the degradation process is obviously not going to be as quick as it would be in some place where, say, I live.
And what chemicals shouldn't be near it?
The only form of chlorine you really have to worry about is calhypo. Calcium hypochlorite is considered a class 2 oxidizer by the DOT, which means that it's highly flammable, highly combustible. And the neatest thing in the world is, and I'm not saying this at all, this is not Wayne talking right now, but the neatest thing in the world is to take a little sprinkle of calhypo and sprinkle it over an oil slick in the driveway and watch what happens. Smoke, fire.
I had a caddy blow up on me.
There you go.
At a house. I've never heard of that happening, but there's some of that must have gotten loose, mixed in with water.
Yeah.
No, this thing blew up. I seriously lost my hearing for the rest of the day. It jumped off the ground. Yeah. I just stared at that caddy because I was like, I do not want to pick that thing up. Oh, it foamed up. It was
pretty impressive, wasn't it? Yeah. It's anything that organic that touches calhypo before you add it to water can cause something like that. So even 1 drop of sweat, leaving open an open container or bag, can cause something like that. It's pretty dangerous to work with. But once you get in the water, it's good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, you premix it, you pour it in, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's good to go. All of the other ones fairly stable. The tablets are good storage-wise. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about chlorine gas, but all of the liquids, lithium, that kind of thing, they're okay. It's just you want to always keep cal-hypo separate from all of the other treatment chemicals, things even like algicides and things like that. You want to keep it separate. And in an ideal situation, separated by like an inert wall, actually, if you can. I know that a lot of times you can't, but that would be the best scenario.
Because if you just keep that next to other chemicals, what do you risk?
Explosions, fire, liability, money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Injury, that kind of thing, yeah. It happened to a warehouse out in Chatsworth, California about 15 years ago. It was actually Leslie's warehouse where it burned it down. They lost millions and millions of dollars in product. Yeah, that was in that warehouse, yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That's where you almost have to be careful if you're ever, which we don't do this really anymore, but if you're kind of distributing maybe 100-pound bucket of that and you're kind of giving, a portion of this to this technician, a portion of that to that technician, if you spill some of that in the warehouse ground, you know what I mean? You're sweeping it up with, oil on the ground or other things going on, and they just like mix up. Could have a real problem on your hands.
Yep. Pretty fireworks.
So what's a good alternative to cal-hypo then for shocking besides liquid?
Besides liquid, cal-hypo, lithium is good, but again, it's hard to get a hold of now, and it's really, really pricey.
Doesn't dichlor make a...
I would never. Did I say never? Never shock with dichlor or trichlor, because you're adding cyanuric acid to a situation where it doesn't need to be. Okay. For every pound of dichlor, which is approximately 2 3-inch tabs, it's actually a little bit more than that, but about 2 3-inch tabs, you're introducing about 5 to 7 parts per million of cyanuric acid and about 12 parts per million of TDS. For trichlor, it's a flat 7 parts per million per 2 3-inch tabs of cyanuric acid and 16 parts per million TDS. Oh. So you're adding more TDS to a situation where it might not be of any kind of benefit whatsoever. So there's no need to add it. So that's what kills me when I go into like the Home Depots, the Lowe's, or Walmart's or something like that, and I look at their shocking products and it's dichlor this, dichlor that. I just want to shake my head because they're trying to sell the product, and that's what their job is to do, to sell the product, but they're selling it for the wrong reasons.
So
I'm stepping off my soapbox now.
That's okay.
No, that's good. Yeah, I'm more curious as why they're able to do that then, if that's not the right way of doing it.
Because they can. That's the answer. They can.
There we go.
Yeah. and homeowners don't know any better. That's why we're here, to hopefully educate people.
So what's an alternative then? Nothing really as far as a shocking...
hydrogen peroxide is okay as a shock, but you have to make sure that it's at a certain strength, like 30 to 40 parts per million worth of it. And it's not the same kind of hydrogen peroxide you get at Walgreens or CVS. It's more like 50%, 40% strength instead of the 2 or 3% you get there. And hydrogen peroxide has some inert materials in it that liquid chlorine, for example, doesn't have. That can bump up TDS too. So, and that's really the only other thing as far as a shock.
So the two best are cal-hypo and
cal-hypo, and in my mind, cal-hypo and sodium hypochlorite are the two best for shocking purposes. And maybe the better question is, what is shocking?
Yep, okay. I almost was about to ask that.
Ding, ding, ding. Okay. Actually, there's a lot of different meanings to the word shock. Okay, there's actually 4. You've got the word shock itself, which is simply the periodic addition of a little bit of chlorine every now and then to clean it up. You had a party on Saturday.
Hyperchlorinate.
Yeah. Well, that's different. Okay, that's different. Okay. So you had a party Saturday night. You wake up Sunday morning, pool's a little cloudy. I'll throw 5 pounds of cal-hypo in there. Cleans it up. Okay, or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, that's shocking. Okay, then you have breakpoint chlorination, and breakpoint chlorination is when you have a measurable combined chlorine reading, and the only way to get rid of that is by doing breakpoint chlorination. In other words, you're adding more chlorine to get rid of chlorine, which sounds kind of stupid, but that's how it works. So you take your combined chlorine reading and multiply that value by 10. Okay, and then that number is how many parts per million worth of whatever chlorine shocking product you prefer to use, add it all at once to get rid of the combined chlorine. Anything left over is then converted to free chlorine. So if you had a combined chlorine reading of, say, 0.4 parts per million, 0.4 times 10 is 4. So you would add 4 parts per million of cal hypo, lithium, sodium hypochlorite, whatever, all at once, gets rid of the combined chlorine, and you're good to go. Then there's hyperchlorination. That's a relatively new term, okay? New within the past 3 or 4 years. And that's something that the CDC came out with. And what hyperchlorination is that if you have a fecal accident in a commercial pool, whether it's loose or solid, doesn't matter, that the things like the CPO books, they have like contact time tables that how long the chlorine has to be at a certain level for a certain amount of time to inactivate the contaminant. Well, hyperchlorination kind of speeds things up. And for example, you can keep 28 parts per million of chlorine for, I think it's 8 hours. I could be wrong, but the number sounds about right, to inactivate whatever contaminants might be in the water from that. It's called hyperchlorination. If you go to the CDC website, cdc.gov, and you type in hyperchlorination, boom, you're going to get a whole ton of information that you never knew you needed to have, but it's right there. And then finally, there's an algae shock. And an algae shock is 30 parts per million worth of chlorine all at once, followed by a lot of brushing and backwashing to waste. So there's really actually 4 things involved. It's just not shocking alone. It's 4 subsets of that.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I know we were just talking about this, and I don't want to forget to say this because I don't think we did this very much last season, but testing the water, from the actual hose spigot that you're putting back into the pool after, draining the pool, or if you're draining the pool halfway and putting new water back in,
right.
Maybe how important it is, because maybe the water has maybe a higher TDS or salt level,
right.
or, other things going on with it, and maybe you don't need to add as much as you thought you did.
Yeah. Anytime you're adding new water to the pool, particularly if it's a brand new fill, or if it's had to drain it halfway, high sign, or whatever, a significant amount of water exchange, always test the incoming water so that you know where your base is. Okay, particularly in areas that have high amounts of certain values. Hello, we're in Phoenix. So Phoenix, Scottsdale, Mesa, all the areas around here have very high hardness readings and very high TDS readings compared to the rest of the country. In my neck of the woods, TDS out of the tap is 400 and hardness out of the tap is 50 parts per million. Wow. 50 parts per million. Yeah, I saw raised eyebrows.
That's great.
Yeah. And it's going to vary. I mean, out in LA, for example, out of the tap and at the Hilton by Disneyland, alkalinity was 800 parts per million.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's going to vary all over the country. So, and this is also particularly important if you're filling your water from a well, because well water has some things in it that municipal water doesn't, like metals, copper and iron, which we all know can cause big time issues with staining if the pH isn't right. Yeah. So always check it.
The well pools are a little bit more complicated, especially if you're having to backwash constantly and different things like that, and you're putting all that back in, and you're just kind of, you could be creating more problems and issues.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So why would you choose what is bromine exactly? Okay. Why would you choose that over chlorine?
Well, there's a couple situations in which bromine has a better a use than chlorine. Bromine's still a halogen. Sanitizers and oxidizers, that same chemical group that's in the periodic chart. But bromine has some values to it. For example, bromine is better in hot water situations because bromine doesn't break down as fast in hot water as chlorine does. Bromine also, when it does break down, and it will break down into bromamines, just like chlorine breaks down into chloramines, when bromine breaks down into bromamines, you don't have to worry about it because bromamines are nearly as effective a sanitizer and oxidizer as what would be considered free bromine. But when you do a bromine test, you just do a bromine test. You don't have to break it down. Bromine is okay outside, but it's not the best choice because it breaks down in sunlight faster than chlorine does. Chlorine inside, yeah, you can use it inside, but remember, chlorine breaks down. And the form that it breaks down into, chloramines, can cause odors and irritations. I mean, how many times have you ever walked into an indoor pool and you smelled chlorine?
Right.
Okay, and that's not good. That's everybody think, oh, they got too much chlorine in the water. No, they have too much combined chlorine in the water, and they haven't shocked to get rid of it.
Sure.
So there's some advantages to it. The other thing about bromine is that bromine is a bully, and bromine will beat up chlorine big time. If you have a molecule of bromine and a molecule of chlorine, chlorine will kind of beat it up and convert the chlorine into bromine. because bromine is 2.25 times heavier atomic weight wise than chlorine. So that, why am I telling you this? Well, some people will say, should I shock a bromine pool? Absolutely. What do you shock it with? Chlorine. Really? Yeah, because chlorine will shock, but anything left over converts to bromine. Now, is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. The bad thing can happen with that comparison is that if you accidentally start adding bromine to a chlorine pool on a consistent basis. So let me set up a scenario for you. You have an outdoor pool, you have a spa attached to the pool, and the spa's on bromine, the pool is on chlorine. Okay? There's a water feature that's a waterfall that goes from the spa into the pool. So you're constantly adding brominated water into a chlorinated environment. You now have a chlorine pool, a bromine pool. Congratulations. Okay. But let's go to that same setup. Okay. But there's no water feature that does that. Okay.
Right.
Spas on bromine, pools on chlorine. Every now and then there's a little bit of splash over, kids jumping in the spa, that kind of thing. Do you have a bromine pool? No. Right. Okay. The other thing too is that I get a lot of questions is, well, I use these sodium bromide products. Is that going to convert my pool to bromine? No. There's not enough bromine in there to cause that conversion. Yeah. But bromine is just as good. It's a little pricey. It's a lot pricey. But in certain situations, it does prove to be a better economical choice than over chlorine.
What are chloramines?
What are chloramines? Chloramines is the form of chlorine that is the after effect of free chlorine doing its job. Free chlorine, active sanitizer, oxidizer, the good cop. Okay. Combined chlorine is then formed after it's done its job. That causes the odors and the irritation. And you always know you have combined chlorines in the pool if you smell chlorine, because that's the classic indicator of the presence of combined chlorine. You need to get rid of them because you don't want people complaining about irritation and itchiness and all that other stuff. Yeah. Yeah. People are always trying to find substitutes for chlorine, and there's stuff out on the market that might sanitize but not oxidize, or oxidize and not sanitize. And they're out there on the market mostly for homeowners in their pools, but not for commercial properties. And, they have a purpose sometimes, but again, you got to make sure that there's sanitation and oxidation going on in there. And how you get to that point, you got to figure out what's best for you.
Yeah. And I think other important things that I think people kind of sleep on is handling these products. I mean, just barehanding chlorine tablets and putting them into a floater or a chlorinator, we're not the best with this, but it's something that I think should be on our minds at all times, where it's using, tongs to pick things up or using gloves
and scoops, but don't interchange scoops between treatment products. If you've got a bucket of Cal Hypo and you've got a scoop in there, only use that scoop for that Cal Hypo. Don't put it into something else, or you get that explosion again.
Yep.
Yeah, and years ago, I mean, that's what changed it, doing some research, but I used to do that because I was, adding that to every pool. So I would have a pound, scoop, and I would have it in the caddy, and then I would just drag it over there. But, with that caddy, it's getting water in there, because if I'm taking the vac head out and I'm vacuuming a pool, it's wet. I'm putting it back in. It's leaking all over. I'm brushing. It's wet. Who knows what's on that brush? It's leaking all over the place. There's so many different things going on that you really have to pay attention, that this is really serious stuff, and you got to be handling it like a professional.
Right. Exactly right. Clean tools will make your job so much easier and so much better. So be diligent about it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Should we talk about salt pools? And
I can talk about it. Sure. Yeah. See what happens.
I definitely think that's good, because the struggle for us is having salt pools and it's not keeping up, and we need to add some type of chlorine floater or something to the pool.
Yeah. The whole thing about salt pools, that started really to become popular. Well, salt pools. Let's back it up. It's really called Chlorine Generation, everybody. It's not a salt pool.
What do you mean?
I
don't have chlorine in my pool.
I know. I've got a salt pool. I don't have chlorine. You just want to kind of bang their head against the wall or something. It's like,
come
idiot.
on, Wayne.
No.
It's salt.
I know. Please kill me now.
I got extra salt in the pool.
No. With Chlorine Generation, what you're doing, you're adding salt, NaCl, sodium chloride, to water, H2O. You get salted water. And you shoot some electricity into this. Now, I'm really dumbing this down a little bit, no offense. But you shoot electricity through it, and then all those chemical parameters separate out and reform. And one of the things that they reform is HOCl, hypochlorous acid, which is the main component of free chlorine. So, sorry, Joe Blow, you've got a chlorine pool. You just don't know you do. Okay.
Right.
So, and the process has improved over the years. The cost of it has lowered over the years. The actual units themselves have become a little bit more easy to manage, that kind of thing. I remember before the thought of putting a chlorine generator on a commercial pool was, no, you can't do that. Well, now they're all over the place.
Sure.
Okay. And that has a lot to do with the cost. But is this a good thing? Well, kind of depends. Okay. The chlorine generator pools that I'm going to call salt pools for right now. Okay. Salt pools have their own unique characteristics, one of which is that salt does push pH up because part of that chemical process, you produce something called hydroxides, OHs. And OHs is what pushes pH up big time. And so you always constantly have to be aware of your pH reading. And whether you have to add acid all the time or plummet an acid feed system, it doesn't matter. You always have to control pH. Okay, you always have to watch it. The other thing with saltwater pools is that it will contribute to TDS greatly. So you always have to be careful of that. So that if the water's been in your pool for a long time, you're going to start seeing your TDS values increase to the point where it could be a problem. And we can talk about TDS in a couple of minutes, a little bit more into that. But with salt systems and how you test them, variety of different ways. And there's test strips out there. There's drop tests. Taylor has both. You can do it electronically. You can do it online. There's a lot of ways you can test for it. But the important thing is that you have to test for salt. How you test it, it doesn't really matter that you test for salt. One of the things that I found is that the online salt systems, Accutrol is one. I'm just naming names now. Accutrol, things like that, that read out a salt level and then adjust the flow of the salted water, the chlorinated water now into the system, can be very inaccurate because they don't clean the probes. And we talked about that earlier. Yeah. So you have to make sure they're clean and calibrated properly. And that's why you should have some kind of a test mechanism to make sure that what that meter is reading is pretty darn close to what you're testing. Right. And if it's off, then there's an issue. Then you talk to the people, the pool and spa store or your service person to figure out what's going on. Also, things like scaling you have to worry about because with some surfaces, if there's too much salt, remember, too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. You can get scaling all over the place, and Pebble Tech is a big one. I've heard a lot of people say they're getting salt buildup on the Pebble Tech surfaces. Well, if you splash salted water out and it evaporates, hello salt.
Right.
You got the crystals forming. Duh. So you just kind of brush it back in the pool, but still, you got to be a little bit careful with that. But I think over and all, I'd like the concept of chlorine generation, salt systems. I just think that a lot of people are really impatient as far as getting things to work, and they want it to work faster and better and things like that, and really don't follow instructions properly. So that's what causes problems. But salt systems, in and of themselves, I think are a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, and also, I don't think people run the pools long enough. When you put a floater in the pool, it's in there
Right.
24 hours a day, and then the customer says, "Oh, well, I only want to run my pool 6 hours a day." That's impossible with a chlorine generator pool.
No,
you can't do that, and it's just sold wrong. I think.
Marketing,
Yeah,
marketing's a good thing.
yeah.
But no, you're absolutely right. So yeah, salt systems, a good concept if you do it right.
Right.
I think so. Yeah.
We call it flaking, but you know why that has those white flakes that get into a salt pool, or what would cause that?
What that is, it can be what we think it's called calcium phosphate. No, I take that back. We know it's calcium phosphate. And what that is that you have a phosphate level in the pool that may or may not be too high, or it could be very low that you don't have to worry about it. But you might have a slightly higher than normal calcium reading. And the calcium, the Ca will form with the PO4, CaPO4, that's calcium phosphate, and form these little flakes that if you touch them, they just kind of, they dissipate out. Yeah. So it's a matter of calcium hardness control and phosphate control. One of the topics that we haven't quite mentioned about or talked about really is monopersulfates. And they're called non-chlorine shocks, which is really a wrong name. They're really non-chlorine oxidizers. These kind of products are used when, say, you have an indoor pool and you need to quote, shock the pool. But if you use chlorine, you're going to have to wait until the chlorine level dissipates down to an appropriate reading that the health department says, yeah, you can get back in, which could lead to a pretty long downtime, and that could be money and things like that. What people use the monopersulfate products will use this as a, quote, shock. And the good thing is you can get back in the water in about half an hour to an hour after it's dosed. It doesn't have any odors or irritation. What monopersulfate does is that it prevents the formation of new chloramines in an indoor pool, okay? But it doesn't kill or get rid of existing chloramines. You still have to use standard breakpoint chlorination for that. But monopersulfate is really good in indoor environments because you control chloramine formation in indoor environments with this product. There's a Polyclear, Polysheen, Oxybright, Oxone. These are some of the brand names of monopersulfate, and the full name of it is potassium peroxymonopersulfate. Don't worry about it; you won't be quizzed or anything. But it's primarily, again, used in indoor pool situations. Monopersulfate is a good product. You dose it by the number of gallons of water in the pool, as opposed to a part per million reading. The quote shock dosage is 2 pounds per 10,000 gallons. So if you have a 40,000 gallon indoor pool, you have 4 times 2, which is 8. So you would add 8 pounds of the product, premix it, pour it in the pool, return lines, that kind of thing. The problem with monopersulfate, and a lot of the listeners probably know about it, is that, again, no good deed goes unpunished. It has a really low pH, really low, like 2.3. You have to be careful about dosing. It does contribute to TDS greatly, but it also mucks up a combined chlorine and total chlorine test because it will give you this incredibly false high answer that you are scratching your head going, what the? It's can't be that number because DPD number 3 has potassium in it. So it's reading the potassium portion of the product that you're adding, so that's why you get that false high answer. There are reagents out there. We have them. Some of the other manufacturers do. That eliminates that interference. We call it a deox reagent. So it's out there. It's a good product if you have an indoor environment where you have to get rid of organics a lot, that kind of thing. You can use it outdoors too, but it's more designed for indoor use. But it's out there. It's really popular out on where I'm from, out in the East Coast, particularly because we have a lot of indoor pools out there because of the season, and people like it. But you have to remember, again, no good deed goes unpunished. There are some things you got to be aware of with it. But it's out there.
I've never seen an indoor pool here.
I don't think we have there. Well, thanks so much for sharing about chlorine.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We truly appreciate you giving us your time and your ear. We know how important and valuable that is. So thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, you can reach us at poolchasers.info@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our tag is Pool Chasers. If you guys could take a minute and go to Apple Podcasts to rate and review the podcast, we would truly appreciate it.
See you out there, Pool Chasers.